an artistic and political organization that, apart from me, exists of several other people. We're a team of about 10 members in the field of art, architecture, design, diplomacy, and we develop what we call alternative parliaments for organizations that are dealing with systemic exclusion from political discourse. So our main focus has been on organizations that are stateless, and specifically that have been reduced to statelessness through so-called terrorist blacklisting. So in the last 10 years, the use of terrorist blacklisting in the so-called war on terror has increased enormously in order to marginalize what is regarded as subversive organizations, organizations that could cause a threat to the supposed stability of the state. Here you see a design of the first parliament that we developed for Congress in Berlin, 7th Berlin Biennial. And these are about 64 flags of organizations that today are on so-called designated list of terrorist organizations. And the consequences are very severe. It means that you have an immediate travel ban, your passport is retrieved, your bank accounts are frozen, and you are prosecuted in all states in which you are blacklisted. So you are effectively placed outside the domain of democracy. This is the terrorist blacklisting. Those who are rendered stateless are literally the physical, the factual boundaries, the proof of that what democracy cannot contain. And that's something that's a paradox. This idea that there is such a thing as a limited democracy that we believe is unacceptable. And our exploration is at what level the space of art can be a space where we reimagine a political discourse or a democratic discourse that is inherently limitless in nature. That is to say, that is not necessarily to say that we support the use of violence. That means that we support a space where a fundamental ideological conflict between opinions and political positions can take place, regardless of what their background is. And we fundamentally oppose the concept of terrorism, the use of the concept of terrorism as a legitimation for rendering people's stateless. The difficulty is also that these are some impressions, some of the speakers that we've hosted at the first summit in Berlin. It goes from the National Democratic Movement of the Philippines, the long-standing, now 40-year underground guerrilla movement in the Philippines that has opposed first Spanish colonization, later on, where it has its historical base in opposition to Spanish colonization, later on fought US occupation of the territory. Today finds the fact that the Philippines is basically on sale for private companies that buy up land, render people stateless through private militias, etc. Movements such as the National Liberation Movement of Azawad, a Tuareg-led coalition of people in the Sahara and Sahel who declared a new state of Azawad in 2012, a size of 1.5 times France. Goes from the Kurdish women movement who are currently fighting in Syria, trained by the PKK against the Islamic State of Iraq and against the Assad regime. Basque independence movement, one of the oldest peoples of the European continent, that still fight for the full independence of their own state and the liberation of prisoners that were part of the former resistance movements against the Franco regime, against the Spanish government that keeps them away from, that keeps them from full independence. So, just to give you a very short impression, what is interesting about these movements, whether you agree with their points of view or not, is that they are all groups that have a history in anti-colonial, liberational struggle. They are all groups that relate, one way or another, to the concept of democracy, and that fight for forms of democracy, whether that is through national liberation movements, that is the case in actually all the men that are present in the picture, or even a step further, the Kurdish women movements, are fighting in the north of Syria, are fighting for democracy without a state. I don't know if what level you follow the news, but the region of Rojava, the north of Syria, as today functions as a democracy of cantons, of assemblies that are interconnected, but that reject the concept of the state as something that has caused colonized people's problem in the first place. And through radical feminists critique the state as a patriarchal, dominating structure. So what's interesting is that the moment you start to unfold this so-called designated list of terrorist organizations, a much more complicated histories start to emerge, in the sense that the danger that these people pose might be more that they're that they are more fundamentally democratic than the states that ban them, or at the very least that they bring to memory histories, suppressed histories, of processes of colonization, military occupation, of proxy warfare, that current states, self-proclaimed liberal capitalist democracies, have no interest in whatsoever of bringing to the surface. So, the last years, our task has been to create this alternative parliamentary structures, here in the form of a gigantic lectern that we built in Leiden in the Netherlands. It takes this form, where basically public and speakers are sitting in the same structure. Every time we developed, for every Congress, we developed a different space. In Berlin, it was really this kind of parliamentary space. Here it was something that almost came close to a courtroom, where we facilitated José María Sison, was the main speaker. You see him here, Professor Sison, founder of the Communist Party of the Philippines and its New People's Army, that I just mentioned before, one of the long-standing guerrilla struggles in the world today, Maoist, strong Maoist signature. And Mr. Sison lives since the 80s in the Netherlands, the country where I'm from. He came here as a refugee. He asked for exile. He never got it. But then international human rights don't allow the Dutch to send him back to the Philippines because the risk is that he would be imprisoned, tortured, and murdered, because he had been imprisoned and tortured before. So much of his community lives in the Netherlands, and he's basically still a stateless figure. And he has been confronted with terrorist blacklisting several times. His organizations are considered as terrorist organizations, and he is considered a terrorist suspect. So he lives in the Netherlands, but is not a acknowledged citizen. At the same time, he cannot travel from the Netherlands because then he would be extradited to the Philippines. So he's basically a non-existent political entity. And we invited him for the Berlin Congress, but obviously he couldn't travel. So we decided we will move the parliament, literally as a nomadic parliament, towards him. And we invited his lawyer, also Mrs. Willem van Lennepkamp, a prominent judge who dealt with several so-called terrorist cases in the Netherlands, Alexander van Dam, public prosecutor, who did the main prosecution of terrorist cases in the Netherlands, Beatrice de Graaf, the director of the Center for Terrorism and Counterterrorism. We basically brought all of these figures around him for him to confront all of the people, all of the layers of the political system, juridical layer, political layer, etc., that define someone being blacklisted from someone being not. So it was almost a kind of alternative trial where he, as a blacklisted subject, was able to confront those who were responsible for the process in which he was placed in this outside sphere of democracy. Last short impression, this was the third parliament that we developed in Kochi, in India, in Kerala. Triangular parliament. So as you can see, every time we also explore the kind of a different spatial, different architectural, geometrical structure, because we're very much convinced that the space of politics, like the way we organize in the space, has an enormous impact on the performative dimension of politics. So the space already articulates an idea. There's no such thing as a neutral assembly. The way we assemble, the way that we are placed, the fact that I'm standing, that you are sitting, the fact that you're not on benches but on chairs, individualizes you in the space. It says something. There's already an ideological notions behind the way that we organize ourselves. So in these alternative parliaments, we also try to rethink what could be the choreography, the sociography, the performative, theatrical dimension of politics. How can we rethink it from the perspective of stateless politics or blacklisted politics? In this case, the triangular parliamentary building that we created, this one we actually built completely, was placed in front of the former British colonial complex. And of course, the state of India that we know today used to be the so-called largest democracy in the world, used to be a British colony, and in the form of the British colony was legalized as a democracy. And many of the organizations that today are blacklisted in India are organizations that still fight the boundaries of the colonial state that became the independent state of India. So they are literally the dark memory, or let's say the repressed memory of the state, continuously trying to reenact themselves through violence, the only language that the state understands, in order to try to create themselves, make themselves visible again in the public sphere, and reclaim histories that were destroyed in the process of colonization first, legalization through the state after. So this triangular parliament we literally built as an extension from the former colonial complex. So it argues spatially, architecturally, there's a direct relationship between the architecture of colonization, military occupation, and the response to it in so-called terrorist organizations, that is say resistance organizations, trying to bring back the memory that was repressed through the colony in the first place. Now, the exceptional space of art doesn't always work. That is to say that we managed now to work together with about 30 different stateless and blacklisted organizations worldwide. That's partly because blacklists do not always correspond. So, for example, groups that are banned as terrorist organizations in the UK are not necessarily banned in Europe. Are they banned in Europe? They're not necessarily banned in India. Speculatively speaking, if you have a parliament that would travel the world, around the world long enough, there would almost always be an exceptional space, kind of grey zone, between political systems, where you could legally facilitate every organization today blacklisted as a terrorist group. That says, of course, everything about the relativity and the interests that define who is a supposed terrorist and who's not. If you can liberate the parliament from the state, if it can become a nomadic entity, you can cross or try to find these kind of grey zones. In this case, in India, that didn't happen, in the sense that my organization itself became accused, when we started to organize the Congress, became accused of material support to terrorist groups. That meant that 3 of the members of my group were accused of giving material support to terrorist groups by organizing the Congress. So we ourselves were not allowed to go back into India and still run the risk of being prosecuted there. But what was interesting as a kind of visual response of the state is that while they prosecuted us, they also gave the intelligence center for counterintelligence, gave the task of the local police to paint over flags that they considered as legal, representing illegal organizations. So the state literally painted into these panels, which were actually also paintings of flags of bad organizations, the state literally painted into the work. One thing that was interesting is that they actually didn't paint over many groups that are blacklisted in India, but they probably just didn't know who they were or that they even existed. So that was an interesting side of it. Another interesting side is that they didn't have enough black paint, so they also used grey paint. And then, in the choreography of painting, they actually placed these grey paints around the lighter panels, red and yellow, and the black paints, they put it around the green, the darker green and blacks. And it was very interesting that they didn't feel any hesitancy in painting over the, let's say, the depictions of the organizations, but they did follow this underlying color scheme. In fact, we always organize the flags by color in the parliament, so they form this kind of strange abstract collages. So there was this kind of choreography of censorship that we were able to influence. And what was very interesting for me, what makes it difficult to call it censorship, is that the state didn't destroy the parliament. They didn't participate in it. They made itself visible in it. The result was just one that I didn't expect. That was that the parliament facilitated the perspective of the state towards these organizations, and what we wanted was to facilitate organizations banned by the state. Anyway, this was, Matteo already mentioned it, one of the last summits that we organized in the Royal Flemish Theatre in Brussels from September 19 to 21, where we facilitated 20 different representatives of states worldwide, going from Tamil Tigers to the state of Colombia, from Basque Country to Balochistan, from the railroad pastors in Namibia, to the West African government, the Filipino Revolutionary Movement, East Turkestan, Kurdistan, and Scotland, of course. And again, we created this alternative parliament, or this parliamentary structure. This time it took the shape of an arena. Of course, in the context of Brussels, there were different layers that we were addressing when it came to this notion of statelessness, or what we refer to as the stateless state. The state referring to 2 different meanings: the state as in the administrative military structure that we call the state, but also the state as a state of mind, our existential state. Here, of course, we are confronted with the European Parliament, where terrorist blacklisting, or the decision who is placed on terrorist blacklists, takes place. There's a commission related to the European Union. It's called the Clearing House. They decide who comes on, who is blacklisted and who is not, who's rendered stateless and who is not. We don't know who these people are. We don't know the criteria based on which they make the decision who is considered a terrorist organization or not. There are no notules, like there's no transcriptions of their meetings whatsoever. It's a completely, I mean, as far as you can get to the criminal core of the functioning of the state, the group deciding who is supposed to be a terrorist organization or not is absolutely by far one of the most, well, let's say, obscure, non-democratic entities installed supposedly to defend democracy from its enemies. So of course this space has a kind of symbolic meaning, importance to organize this specific summit. This is a parliament in action, in use during the 3-day Congress. Central to the space was this map, and this map basically represents all the 20 different territories that were spoken about that were represented in these 3 days. 20 unacknowledged states. So they formed some kind of alternative world map, but in that sense they also formed this, what you would call the script, seeing that we were in the theatrical space, seeing that politics in general is a theatrical concept, or space and theatrical performative notions. Basically it was the script that during the 3 days was supposed to be unfolded. Let's call it, you could say that this is the kind of, how should I put it, the shadow map or the subterranean map underlying our existing world order, underlying our current perception of the globe, of separation between different states. These are all states that have their own histories, their own struggles, but that are not inscribed visibly in neither the political order, neither its representation. So in the 3 days, our task was to start to unfold this alternative world map and make visible the underlying, let's call it history, but then according to the resistance, instead of history according to the victors. So we had different representatives that introduced their states, but we were also looking for what we describe as status international. The possibility, inspired by the Kurdish women movement, not so much to seek for acknowledged states, but to start building relationships between unacknowledged states, stateless states, and seek for alternative transnational structures of representation that would no longer rely on the global political order, which is at the basis of much of the sufferings of peoples that we work with in the first place. So this is Simon Isatiogo representing the government of West Papua. Very interesting case because West Papua, currently colonized by Indonesia, is a territory with hundreds of different communities, even an enormous amount of differentiated language. So they have their own government, but the raising of their own flag is already considered a terrorist offense, let alone that the government could actually function as such. So the government itself is blacklisted. Nonetheless, they are able to represent these different communities, and they have just written a new common constitution that was approved by all these different communities. So many of these unacknowledged states do operate as independent or functioning governments, even though they are not recognized. This relates, I think, when Emily was speaking to her talk as well. We have here from the World Uyghur Congress, representing East Turkestan, colonized by the Chinese, very much in contact with their Tibetan counterpart, or alliance, you would say, but unfortunately, in the context of the war on terror, East Turkestan has a majority of the Muslim population, and this is a very unpopular and badly mediatized kind of status group to be. It's better to be a secular group today if you want to be acknowledged or recognized or supported by the international community as a stateless group. So there's also these awkward aspects. The moment that you have to question that, however tragic what I'm going to say now is, that for example, the fact that we even know what Palestine is already a win, even though it's in a condition of colonization and oppression that is absolutely beyond horrific. But then if I say Baluchistan, East Turkestan, Azawad, then most people wouldn't even know where the hell to begin to tell the story of that. So this was also an attempt to broaden all of these different notions of statelessness. In this case, Somaliland split off from Somalia. This is Dilar Dirik from the Kurdish women movement, one of our great examples. And I want to round up the part of the New World Summit here, because as you see, each of these groups had their own maps. We developed for them, and in collaboration with them. It was a very interesting process, because for us it's very important that when they represent their states, that we don't have to say Basque Country in Spain, or Azawad in Man, or well, whatever other East Turkestan in China, that you can speak directly from that specific territory and represent it directly. Now what's interesting is that all the cases I showed before are actually clearly delineated states. There's a clearly delineated idea which territory belongs to which people. In the case of the Kurdish group, it gets more interesting, because we have to develop a map for a group that refuses the concept of the state as such. So what they propose is this ideological model. This is the group currently fighting in the north of Syria, in the Rojava region, fighting for what they call democratic confederalism, or democratic autonomy, gender equal, multi-ethnic, secular states, secular cantons, refusing the structure of the state, and on all levels demanding what they call representation through co-presidency. So a representative of a canton can never be a man or a woman, it always has to be a man and a woman. This is part of their social contract, their constitution of the different regions. And the same counts for all different religious groups within the regions. So all religious groups always have to be represented by a man and a woman, and all religious groups, even whether they are minorities or majorities in the region, have to be represented equally. So this is an interesting moment where, in a way, our role as facilitators of groups that do not have direct political representation changes also in, let's speak from a pedagogical perspective, changes in us becoming students of alternative forms of political practice and representation. I'm saying this because for me it's very important to emphasize that the New World Summit is not a platform for helpless, stateless entities. That even though there's obviously great suffering behind the histories of all of these organizations, all of these groups, they do have governments, they do have their own people's armies, they have their own constitutions, they have their own histories and cultures and language. And that's something that stands also for enormous pride and autonomy. And that's something to learn from. These are the new worlds that we can learn from. It's not just a question of victimized peoples that need help from outside. In that regard, 7 minutes left. Here the Azawadian state again, that I mentioned earlier, new state in the north of Mali. In that regard, we also developed projects in which we try to engage directly with the groups in the territory. Here, for example, the National Liberation Movement of Azawad. So that's the northern part of Mali that wants to become independent. In the case of the Netherlands, this is an important case because at this moment the Dutch are part of the MINUSMA mission, International Stabilization Mission, to fight jihadist groups in the north of the state. So at this moment, Dutch soldiers are working in the territory that they do not know is also considered the independent state of several peoples from the northern Sahara. We traveled together with the National Liberation Movement. These are some images that I took from the territory to explore not only the question what is our role in trying to facilitate and make visible the statist political struggle with anti-colonial liberation histories, but also to understand how is the process of representation taking place within the territory itself. So how do statist states represent themselves within their own and towards their own constituencies. So here you see the flag of the new state of Azawad that in essence only exists since 2012 when it was declared independent for the first time. An interesting thing is that it's a flag that you find in many different areas controlled by the MLA, many different manifestations. So here even in the kind of village environment, painted on the water tower, politicizing day-to-day life in the process of creating new states. This is artist Ibrahim Massoud, an artist that belongs to the Songhai community, who is the main artist, poet, radio maker responsible for creating the images of the new state of Azerbaijan. You have to imagine that you're talking about a territory 1.5 times France, no running water, no electricity, no roads, hardly any hospitals, hardly any functioning schools, zero infrastructure. Zero infrastructure. It's basically that vast territory that we saw at the beginning. He has the task of creating imagery that binds together peoples that for a long time have been separated, also through long-standing ethnic struggle between different groups that are now part of the new liberation movement. So that goes until the use of different languages in slogans. All the slogans always have to at least include languages to address all the different language communities. In this case, this is language Tamashek. It's Tamashek language speaking our science, one of the oldest heritage in the world, French, Arabic. So basically his task here, for example, in the form of a monument painted in the national colors of the new state, in his murals. It's kind of interesting. There's a lot of this kind of murals that you find everywhere in territory. He's the only one who signs them. So that's definitely a sign that you're talking about a real artist. Something that's never, his authorship is you can never be taken away. The interesting process, the interesting thing from this engagement with the groups in the territory themselves is that we realize that the role of art and the role of culture, from our perspective, of course, in the liberal summits, it's about reimagining the political process. A political process that went wrong, went horribly wrong, up until the process of blacklisting, the secularization, the creation of boundaries of limits of democracy. Here, it's about a different role that art takes. This image, I think, is the most telling. You have this image of the Sahara, and then out of nowhere comes this first planted sign. It's not even a flag, this is actually more like a canvas, where the new flag is painted on. And what that sign does is, it gives history to a territory that you would otherwise not see. It tells the history of a new state, it tells the history of different struggles of different peoples from the territory. It also projects the future state, the representation, the imagery of the new state. But that state doesn't exist in the sense of infrastructure. It doesn't exist in the sense of infrastructure like as a city, as we tend to think. It first of all exists as an idea, it exists as a cultural expression. And this, I think, is absolutely crucial when it comes to the notion of art and culture of liberation movements, is that it rethinks the state, not in terms of administration, military occupation, but in terms of a cultural expression. And that's the reason why, or that's one of the reasons why we founded the New World Academy, that's related to the sub-department of the New World Summit, where we invite these groups, that we work with, the status groups that we work with, to work together with artists and students from the field of art, also conflict studies, political science, etc., to explore the role of art at the heart of political struggle. The role of art in developing new models of political representation, and to learn directly from movements that for a long time have had basically nothing but cultural struggle to represent their causes, or at least in which military struggle and cultural struggle go hand in hand. Because why do we fight? We don't fight to fight. We fight for histories, for language, for, against the censorship, the annihilation of the specificity of the culture, or cultural history. We also publish books, for example, with our Filipino friends, key texts on the role of art in the National Democratic Movement of the Philippines. I keep track of my time, I see it. 2 minutes left. This is the space of the Academy, where we bring together case studies from each of the movements that we invite. This space is located in Utrecht, because we co-founded the New World Academy with BAC, the Center for Contemporary Art, very much roots on the boundary between art and politics. And here we organize 3-day sessions with speakers, with representatives directly from the movement. Here, Professor José María Cizón, that you saw earlier, but also Mrs. Fierce Lisa Ito. That work together is try to explore, explain, contextualize all these different objects, works that come directly from this liberational movement. So it goes from the most simple. This, for example, educational material is used to explain dialectical materialism to peasants in the outskirts of the Filipino community. as a Maoist movement, is of course very much focused on the Western area. What's very interesting is that in their use what they call social realism, so the use of imagery in the independence movement, is that there's no immediate restrictions. So whether it's comics, educational theater, painting, whatever, all means, by any means necessary and through all cultural means possible, mass education has to take place. This is another example, which I think is really great. So two martyr images, so they are depictions of revolutionary fighters who died in the process of creating the revolution, but they are made in exactly the same period. So here you have this kind of very classic social realism imagery, a heroic worker coming together, bringing together peasant communities, fighting oppressors, etc. The shadow of the martyr that stands behind the revolutionary moment, slightly romantic writings amongst them. And here you have this bizarre post-pop image of the revolutionary fighter, but these two are made in exactly the same period. So all means whether they're contemporary pop art types of influences or more classic forms of social realism are included. This is a very interesting case also in the use of protest poetry, which was actually introduced by the Spanish colonizer as a form that adopted by the resistance movement, and today used to create these gigantic puppets that are pushed forward in gigantic demonstrations depicting the oppressor, in this case President Aquino III, before they are publicly burned. And then all these slides represent all different factions within the movement, and they dance around the figure until it's completely destroyed. This is almost what you call a form of people's trial. Art is people's trial. Art is the one depicting the oppressor, but also creating a choreography through mass protest in which a new collective of all of these different factions comes together, defines itself as a revolutionary entity, destroys the oppressor, which is in a way the artwork, but the artwork then transforms into a new political consciousness of the people fighting. It's a very, very specifically ideologically argued form of art practice. And in the academy we take these kind of examples to develop, apart from living together, eating together, discussing together, as you can see here, we take these examples to develop, in this case, to challenge alternative forms of people's trials. The main problem that the Filipino independence movement brings forward is that we can be prosecuted by our states, but we cannot prosecute the state itself. How do we reverse that system? A people's trial is in essence that, a fundamental claim to an alternative form of justice. In this case it was through the notion of art that this was explored. And our students, together with the National Democratic Movement of the Philippines, proposed, inspired by this, and in collaboration with them, what they call the open source tribunal. A form of tribunal that any group that feels it needs to oppose the monopolies of power of the state can use temporarily to bring forward its critique. So in this case it took place at the end of 2013. These are the principles of the open source tribunal that the students developed: the principle of openness, equality, solidarity, self-empowerment, creativity. In essence, the trial that everyone can obtain or use. And the first users of the tribunal were the Filipino community itself. At that time, they were facing the horrors of the typhoon Haiyan. I guess many of you can remember. There was this enormous typhoon, many people that were displaced and lost their lives. And according to the Filipino community, this is something that the corrupt state could easily have stopped. So they used the open source tribunal to bring forward this accusation. This took place in the church in the center of Utrecht. Here there's a kind of shadow figure projected of the President Aquino III, far less dramatic than these gigantic puppets, very soberly floating in the air. These were representatives of the Filipino movement that brought forward their accusations one by one. And after every accusation was brought to the trial, brought to the tribunal, a shadow play started that enacted the accusation, and a one-person choir sang, reflected back the accusation. So it became also an educative play in a way. They tried to visualize and engage an audience, implicate them in the specific causes or specific sufferings that at that moment were taking place in far, far away land. That's generally how these plays are represented. Here are some sketches of one of our students. Now, I'm out of time, so I'm going to go into the other cases. So we've now arrived at the 5th session of the New World Academy. So we work together first with the Revolutionary Filipino movement. We work together with Refugee Collective, We Are Here. Emily was one of the coordinators on behalf of Silent University. So we also try to connect other forms of educative platforms that are looking for new modes of representation for stateless peoples and stateless political groups. We work together with international pirate parties, which is a very different form of stateless organization, but a political party that mainly uses the internet as a non-state entity to redefine the practice of democracy as what they call liquid democracy. So democracy as a global project rather than something that has territorial limitations. We work together with the National Liberation Movement Azawad, that was upon several times. And we are currently working together with the Kurdish movement, which I'm very proud of because we really see them as leading figures, ideologically speaking, of how we can transform or pursue our own search for a democracy that liberates itself from the territorial confines of the state. Not only because we don't believe that these territorial confines exist, they only keep up the illusion that our world is not defined by entities, corporate entities, and extra-legal entities that do not regard the limits of the state, that disregard the limits of the state on all levels. So the project, the old project, so-called old project of internationalism, of rethinking solidarity, rethinking structures that can overcome these fictional territorial limitations and redefine democracy as a practice, as a stateless practice, not in terms of victimization, but as a positive, as an empowering aspect. That's something that for us is really crucial, and that's something where, as much as we hope that we can contribute to the struggles of the groups that we work with, at the end it's us that need them when it comes to reimagining or bringing forward the concrete proposition of what the new world that is kind of inherent to our title is or could be. So we feel in that sense we're as much the ones who are trying to create a platform as that we are students, or at least those who are taught by most of the groups that we know.